So welcome everyone to the fourth event in the Public Thought Leadership series hosted by the Library, and the second for this year. The Thought Leadership event series, spearheaded by our Deputy Vice-Chancellor Simon Barry, aims to celebrate Western Sydney University's #1 ranking in the Times Higher Education Index, which assesses universities against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The event series aims to celebrate and promote this #1 ranking, complementing work being done across the uni as part of its Sustainability and Resilience Decadal Strategy. I'd like to do acknowledgement of country. With respect for Aboriginal cultural protocol and out of recognition that its campuses occupy their traditional lands, Western Sydney University would like to acknowledge the Darug, Darawal, also referred to as Tharawal, Gundungurra and Wiradjuri peoples, and thanks them for their support of its work in their lands, Greater Western Sydney and beyond.
So today's topic is life after school for young people with intellectual disability. I want to be more than a disability person. This session is presented by Associate Professor Lise Mogensen, School of Medicine, Professor Gabrielle, School of Social Sciences, Dr. Jenny McDonald, School of Medicine, and Dr. Nicole, School of Health Sciences, and Director of Believe and Become Occupational Therapy, all from Western Sydney University. The researchers present findings from a recent study exploring the transition from school to adult life as experienced by young people with intellectual disability. Findings from interviews with parents, educators, health and disability service providers will also be presented. Questions and discussion will be invited from the audience. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the introductions to both Badra and Emma for their help with the session. So I'm an associate professor at the School of Medicine. My background is not in medicine. I'm an occupational therapist with a PhD in social justice. And I have most of my research interests are in critical disability studies, childhood studies, and health sociology and wellbeing. So a bit of a broad bunch, and this is why you get to engage with so many lovely projects and people. The presentation today is drawn from a research project that we conducted with young people with intellectual disability who had recently left school or not so recently left school. We also interviewed parents, a couple of educators and some service providers, but the presentation today is really going to focus on the young people's experiences, and we will put a little bit of findings in from parents and service providers, but it is really about the experiences that the young people had. But before we start, I would also like to pay my respects for the traditional owners of the lands that we are on here today at Liverpool City campus. And that includes the Capricorn clan of the Darug Nation. The Darug Nation, but also the people of Tharawal and Gundungurra nations. I recognise that these are unceded lands, and I would like to acknowledge other First Nations people across Australia and anyone that are joining us today. So my colleagues here, I've got Dr. Jenny McDonald and Professor Gabrielle with us here, and Dr. Nicole is online and will be presenting our findings a little bit later on from where she's joining us. Well, I'd also like to say that as a research team, we are people living with disability, chronic illness or impairment. We are parents, carers of people with disability, mental health problems, and we are working in the field as well. So we are hoping that we're trying to get as many perspectives in on people's lives as possible. So today, we'll go through the background to the study for a little bit first to look at the some policies as well, guidelines that are around transition from school. We'll look at the research question and the methods that we used. And then Nicole will come in to present the findings, and then we'll finish up with discussion and questions. And hopefully summary, but we'll see how we go for time now because we've lost a little bit. So the first thing I was going to get everyone to do was to just log into that QR code, because I'd really like to know who's joining us today, both online and in the studio here. And then as we go, it doesn't have to be right now. I won't be spending time looking at it right now, but I will do that when Nicole starts to present. But if you can log into there, use that code, and then we'll be able to see who's here today. And then later on, we'll find out what people are mostly interested in. So we'll start with the background to the study. So when we started this study, we knew that leaving school and figuring out what you want to do after is something that a lot of young people struggle with. It's often a time where they seek to develop their own identity and start searching for opportunities for meaningful engagement or meaningful occupation, studying, but also sometimes traveling, starting a family, and so forth. There's often instability for young people because they might at the same time, leave home and exploring their identity in between adolescence and adulthood. And some people refer to that stage as sort of emerging adulthood. But I think for and we'll get to that later, for our group of people, it was a much longer time span. So concentration here is typically placed on achieving self-sufficiency and becoming a productive member of the community, focusing on fostering community roles and relationship and education, housing options and so forth, which I just alluded to before. So young adults living with disability, young people living with disability hold similar goals and aspirations, of course, to their peers without disability and during this important time of life. They want to be accepted, respected, they want to participate meaningfully, and they want to have a choice about their lives and what they do in their lives. They want to have meaningful connections with others and contribute to the world around them. However, if you look at the literature, it continues to highlight the barriers for young people with disability, and especially young people with intellectual disability. And they fare poorer when you look at outcomes and percentages and statistics. They fare poorer in terms of engagement in education and work and social participation than others. Part of that is because they leave a structured school environment. Their regular supports are withdrawn, and they often experience stigma, exclusion, and they usually have more limited post-school options. There are fewer relationships, participate less in social activities, and are given less opportunity to take responsibility and make decisions, and so participate less in employment and education. Some of their young there are just a few examples here. I'm just going to show you. These are posters that young people in one of our groups had made with their service providers. They had all created these little gold posters that were sitting in their little workstations where they were doing some training. So you can see here when you look at Nick's gold post that he there's a lot about staying healthy and getting stronger, but it was certainly also about living independently, have good health and be active. Nick also was very interested in having a family of his own. Aisha was similar in some of those, staying healthy and being stronger, and she wanted to travel the world and also be raising a family. And so many of these goals are quite similar. Wanting to finish a TAFE course is from Susan's goals. She also wanted to improve her riding. I get a feeling that there might have been a fitness person in here because they're all wanting to be fit, stronger and faster. And in Australia, we find that people with intellectual disability have low rates of employment and many are underemployed. Only 32 people with intellectual disability are employed compared with 83% of people without disability. And only 6.9% of people with intellectual disability receive specialist services designed for open employment, of which only 50% of those 6.9% obtain open employment. Research has highlighted a number of reasons that young people with intellectual disability have poorer outcomes than their peers without disability. So many really struggle with negotiating transition to post-school context, depending on how well they have been prepared in the transition or pre-transition period. There's a wide variation in adoption of adult roles related to employment, independent living, friendships and day activities. We know that poor post-school outcomes are linked with ineffective collaboration between school systems, adult disability services and the paid and unpaid workforce. We also know that poor planning, transition planning, leads to reduced participation in employment and tertiary education, and also to isolation and mental health difficulties. It is also documented by a significant body of evidence that is focused on transition experiences that post-school outcomes improve when transitions are well planned and when planning starts early. When it's coordinated and bring together all its key stakeholders, including students and families, educators, community members and service organisations. The process of preparing to leave school, including identifying support and opportunities to achieve meaningful goals after leaving schools, helps with further study, voluntary work, paid work and leisure activities, helps developing and maintaining relationships as well. So we know that having a formal transition plan document in place is critical in supporting anticipated changes such as leaving school. It focuses on gaining shared understanding between all of those shareholders of the needs by the students involved to ensure that their individual requirements are met. In Australia, there is a general acknowledgement in the National School Reform Agreement that planning for transition out of school is most important for all young people, so that they gain the skills they need to transition to further study and employment or life success. However, there is no single Australia-wide transition policy. Individual states have policies and best practice frameworks for the general school population and also provide evidence-based guidelines on how to support students with disability to leave school. There are some shared characteristics between these guidelines that say that planning should start early, be person-centred and ensure collaboration between young people, family, school and post-school services. That they should start early is a little bit of a, how long's a piece of string, I guess, because in the literature will say starting as soon as they start high school, but in Victoria and Queensland it's year 10, in New South Wales it's year 12. So, what does starting early actually mean? All state departments provide resources and templates to guide transition planning, but the implementation of transition planning and preparation is left up to individual schools to manage. The next slides illustrate the transition pathways outlined by the New South Wales Department of Education with the different options for young people after leaving school. And so the key pathways here is study and work, further study, find a job, become work ready, or otherwise community participation, such as volunteering and socialising. Many of these options require young people to have access to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, including school leaver employment support, Australian Disability Enterprises and social participation options with supports And as most of you probably will be aware of, since 2015, as Australia has gradually changed from that social welfare model of disability support to our consumer-focused, market-based system with the introduction of the NDIS. And so with this change, there was a promise from the NDIS development that this would increase consumer choice and control with access to new skills, to jobs, greater independence, quality of life, and improved social participation. So our research question then became looking at all this. So we know we have guidelines in place. We know that there are policies, and we have this change for greater choice and control. Our research question then became, what is it like for young people with intellectual disability to leave school, begin adult life in the context of now having the NDIS? So the aim of the study was to firstly, as I said earlier on, focus on the young people's experiences, but we went a bit wider than that and talked to different stakeholders, but we will try and focus mostly on young people's experiences in this presentation. Our research was conducted across New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. In the early parts of this study, we engaged a Sydney-based advisory group to help design and direct the research. This was to ensure that the research was relevant to the group of people that we actually wanted to work with, and making sure that the research stayed relevant to them. There was 5 young people who all identified as living with intellectual disability, and they advised on our methods and our questions in particular. And so, for example, one of the members suggested that we look more into young people's desires to find partners and families and what that looked like for them, because that was something that was important for the people in the group. So we actually added that, and we found that not a lot of other studies have really focused very much on those social roles. So the data collection methods included some surveys, some semi-structured interviews, and focus groups with young people. We also had some questionnaires and a few interviews with parents and teachers and service providers. So for the young people included, we had 15 females and 12 male participants aged 19 to 33. We thought initially we were going to sort of focus to up to maybe 25, but it soon became clear to us that the transition they were experiencing was a much longer period. So we analysed all the data using reflexive thematic analysis as described by Braun and Clark, and this analysis method allowed us to systematically identify and organise patterns of meanings within all of our data. So from here, it might be easier now that Nicole shares her screen. From here, we organised research findings into a number of themes.
All right, good afternoon everyone. My name is Nicole Sharp and I am an occupational therapist. I'm coming to you today from Dharawal land in Tamil, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I appreciate you having me join from online today. I've been out delivering services in the community this morning, and our organisation predominantly supports children and young people with disabilities, including those with intellectual disability. I'm also an adjunct fellow at Western Sydney University, which is what this research relates to. So I'm really privileged today to present the findings of these young people's perspectives. We know that young people's voices are often, not brought to the forefront in research, and that's something that we were very passionate about resolving within this study. So this slide presents, I guess, the overall themes developed from the young people's perspectives. So the overarching theme generated through our analysis was searching for meaning and purpose. This describes, I guess, the overall focus of what young people were wanting to achieve in their lives as they transitioned from high school into adult roles. The overarching theme was made up of 3 organising themes, and each of those had 3 sub-themes. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to be breaking down the findings and highlighting through the words of young people their experiences. As Lise mentioned in this presentation, we are focusing on privileging the voices and experiences of young people with intellectual disability. We have added a couple of quotes as well from parents, educators and service providers, where these further contributed to the experiences of the young participants. The overarching theme, as I mentioned, was searching for meaning and purpose. For the participants in our study, there was a real sense for most of them that they had not yet reached a purposeful destination. They felt stuck in a perpetual state of transition within a service provider, or sometimes moving between service providers, because they weren't finding what they were looking for or what they were hoping for in those service providers. Very few felt that they were receiving the right level of support to help them achieve the major goals and outcomes that were important to them. And as Lise mentioned earlier, for the young people in our study, it was the same as what other research is showing at the moment. These young people just want exactly what all other young people want as they move into adulthood. So as I mentioned, the overarching theme was made up of 3 themes, and I'm going to introduce each of those now. So the first theme was transition planning, policy versus reality. So our data suggested that transition processes infrequently align with the policy and guidelines that do exist, which Lise introduced briefly earlier. These guidelines advise that transition preparation should commence as early as possible during the secondary school years. However, several of our participants said that the preparation was left to the last few months or even the last few weeks before they were finishing school. The experiences of transition planning before leaving school varied significantly between participants, with inconsistencies in both the processes and the timing of transition, but also in terms of the opportunities they were given and the level of support that they received. On occasions, there was a more systematic process of preparing students in place, and some students left school well prepared and with some level of awareness of their skills and with a place to go. However, many others were left totally unprepared and struggling to find meaningful roles and activities. So the first of the sub-themes within this broader theme was the reality of planning and information. So the experiences of transition planning before leaving school varied significantly between participants. There was a lack of information provided, there was a lack of support, people weren't linked in with supports that they needed. Some of the young people weren't sure of the meaning and the use of the transition planning. They felt like they hadn't actually been given many options to choose from at all, if any. The participants also told us that they had really inconsistent levels of access to work experiences. Their work experience opportunities where they had them were often linked to specific areas such as hospitality and retail, and were not necessarily aligned to the individual's goals. So rather, people's experiences were often really heavily tied to the experiences, skills and approach of particular staff members, whether they be good or bad. So rather than there being a consistent approach to transition, what we found in our study was that these young people's experiences were often really inherently tied to a particular individual's level of expertise and support. So one of our participants, who we have called Amelia, said, like the principal, and I was like very close and everything, and they asked what I wanted to do. So this young girl felt well connected with even the principal within her school. However, for many other young people, they did not have that level of support within their schools. So similarly, within the parents' perspectives that we gathered in this study, they also highlighted similar things: a lack of information, a lack of experiences like work experience. They felt that they had to kind of do things themselves, and they felt that the young person was rushed out the door. They reflected that for some of those who kind of had previous children and things, they reflected that they felt like there used to be more offered in the way of transition planning than what was currently available. So for example, prior to the NDIS, some of them reported, providers would come through, they would talk to schools, families would go out on buses with their school groups to visit the range of various service providers in the local area. They felt that this was something that was no longer being offered. One parent said, "I don't even know what the teacher's name is that looks after it. She turned around and has given me a list of names to ring and see whether or not they would be okay." So this parent was literally provided a list of local service providers, and that was the extent of transition planning for their young person. Another parent reported, "I don't know why the information wasn't out there or why it was so hard to get. It just seemed you had to find out yourself. There wasn't a lot of support in what was available." Another added that it seemed like the school just wanted us out the door, ready for the next cohort. Similarly to the young people, parents were also frustrated with the limited work experience opportunities offered to their child at high school. One school's low expectations were highlighted by a mother who reported, they said it was too difficult to get him any work experience. He could go and sell chocolates in the foyer at the school if he wanted. So this is reflective of a lot of things that came up within this research, this level of low expectation that people around young people with intellectual disability often place on them. The next sub-theme is a lack of choice and control. We very strategically chose this name of the theme. The choice and control, we all know, is something that's thrown around a lot in relation to the NDIS, but in this case, young people's experiences were not of choice and control, they were a lack of. There was a lack of opportunities provided to young people to try out different pathways and options or work experience when they were at school. They didn't have the control over choosing those options for themselves. Choices were often made for young people by others, based on some kind of assumption or, again, a low level of expectation. For some of them, they talked about pathways being selected for them when teachers didn't see their potential. Kirsty said, "They kept telling me I'd be no good at anything else." And Hayden clearly explained his discontent by saying, "I don't want people that are like just making choices for me." Young people also highlighted a limited choice of service providers within certain geographical areas and the fact that those providers may not offer programs which are necessarily aligned to their interests. So feeling like they were kind of provided with very few choices about kind of where to go based on their geographical location. The next sub-theme was finding paid employment is really hard. And again, this was consistent with previous research. We know that the outcomes, employment outcomes for people with disabilities on the whole are very poor in Australia, and certainly that is the case also for young people with intellectual disability. For several of our participants, their life goals really remained undefined and unfulfilled long after leaving school. For some of these people, as Lise mentioned earlier, we had kind of planned to stop recruiting people at around the age of 25, but we realised that there were people in their early 30s who really were still stuck in this transition phase of life, who still were, experience a sense of unfulfillment in their meaningful activities. Most of our participants talked about the fact that they wanted a paid job to help enable their level of independence. Some of them had been engaged with disability service providers for more than 8 years. They may have completed one or more courses at TAFE, gained some work experience and contributed as volunteers, but very few had opportunities for employment, let alone paid employment. The only 2 young people who had ongoing jobs in our research were both working with family members or in their family business. Several young people had switched service providers numerous times in the hope of finding support or programs that would help them towards further training or employment, but often they reported that what was promised to them was not delivered. According to Paul, who had completed several TAFE courses, the experience for looking for a job was frustrating and like waiting to win the lottery. He said, looking for a job is like waiting here for that lottery ticket to draw your name out. Paul also eloquently described his experience with an employment service that he felt did little to support his search for employment. He said, so they're basically, not very well structured. All they were doing with me was saying, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? Instead of going, okay, let's actually work through the process of getting a job. They didn't get me out there for work experience. They were a total nightmare. Within their stories, it was evident that our participants felt let down by a system that was hard to navigate. Despite several years of completing different training courses and volunteer roles, they felt confined to being clients of disability service providers. Most really wanted paid jobs, but few were on track to paid employment, and they shared a sense that employment services do little to support their search. James, who had been with the same employment agency for 5 years without getting a paid job, stated that he felt disillusioned with the efforts of the agency. I'm hoping that I can one day move along and get a job. Paul, who had been fighting for both NDIS funding and job support services, said, I just don't feel like these people actually give a damn. Hayden had explored the things he would need to do to give himself a better chance at finding a meaningful job, but expressed feeling trapped in a life with disability services and switching between providers. Now, Hayden's quote is actually the one that we've utilised to really demonstrate the crux of the whole picture from this research. I want to do more in life than just be a disability person. I want to be out there. I'm going to go on now to talk about theme 2, which is experiences of freedom and loss. We asked participants about the best and the hardest things that they experienced when leaving school. Several participants had found school life really challenging, not just academically, but also, and sometimes particularly, socially. And so for some of them, there was a strong sense of freedom and relief from leaving school. So the first sub-theme of this theme was escape and freedom to do other things. Leaving school provided freedom and relief from both the academic and social challenges for some people. People talked about the best things about leaving school, including having the freedom to do other things, getting away from a restrictive environment, enjoying the fact that there was no more homework. Sarah expressed a much stronger sense of relief in leaving school. She said, getting away from a toxic environment that stifles any creativity or individuality, while Shyla was simply relieved to leave the negativity behind. Sorry, it's not a very positive story so far, is it, guys? The next sub-theme was feeling lost in the big world. There were many challenges connected with leaving school, and young people expressed a sense of feeling a bit lost, or as Jack put it, feeling scared and nervous in a new world. Sophia said that while she enjoyed not having the pressures she had felt at school in terms of presenting in a certain way, since leaving school she had struggled with social isolation and not knowing how to function without the schedule of the routine of a school day. Young people also missed particular teachers or particular subjects that aligned with their interests. So, people had at times had a really special teacher, someone who just got them, who heard them, who listened to them, who provided support to them. And these people were really, really missed. The next and final sub-theme of this theme is loss of social connections. Leaving school had, for many of the participants, meant the painful loss of friendships. For Sophia, the isolation after leaving school had been hard, and others talked about feeling sad about leaving their friends and how they were missing these friends in their everyday lives. Most of the participants explained that they had found maintaining connections with friends from school difficult after they left. After unsuccessfully trying to contact several different school friends, Nick said he felt like they just don't care about me anymore. Hayden explained feeling conflicted and insecure about trying to maintain connections with friends because some of these connections had been challenging at school as well. He said, it was hard to fit in at school. And when it came to like graduating, I kind of felt on the outs because I didn't really get to hang out with other people much. Christina said, I haven't really had anyone in the past year or two. It's really hard to start something. She was referring to making new connections or friendships. Our third and final theme is navigating adult roles and relationships. And again, this is broken up into 3 sub-themes. So the first of those is the importance of parental agency and advocacy in accessing funds and services. Accessing disability services beyond school and obtaining sufficient funding through the NDIS was a frustrating process for participants, and it relied heavily on their capacity to advocate for themselves or having support from a family member or other support person who was able to advocate on their behalf and who could understand and speak the right language. Young participants commonly mention parents as being important to transition planning and in advocating for them to access funding and services. Paul, who was one of our older participants, had found the processes of accessing the NDIS funds something that he couldn't manage at all on his own, and he described how help from his mum had been essential in navigating the NDIS planning meeting and dealing with what he perceived to be a hostile planner. He said, Mum, she's the one, she's the brains behind, applying for the NDIS and the NDIS getting on board with some things. He lamented that to get funding to support his goals and needs, you had to meet very strict criteria, you had to be very assertive, and you had to use the correct terminology for funded items. He referred to this as being like having to bark like a dog in the correct way. He said the NDIS requires just trying to bark correctly. You will be barking, constantly at them to try to get something out of them. Building on the young people's perspectives around the importance of having parents or other support people who can advocate for them, the parents' perspectives also reinforced this. Families needed support to help them navigate the system, and there were really significant barriers encountered when there was no one to advocate for an adequate funding package. Accessing the NDIS and receiving individualised funding adequate to meet needs was a challenge that eluded many families. One parent said, if you don't know what you're asking for or what you're doing, well, you're going to get nothing, And if you don't know the language to use, then you're going to get nothing. Parents lamented the lack of choice of post-school services and felt that promises were left broken. I'm not wasting my time because you promise everything, deliver nothing. One parent felt service offerings were tokenistic and often kept people with intellectual disability left hidden away from genuine community participation. They said they might be going for the tokenistic game of bowling. I don't know why they think all people with a disability want to go bowling, right? There were some exceptions mentioned about individual schools. So there were some really innovative examples of things that were provided. So 2 teachers described some of the activities that their students would engage in from year 11 onwards. These opportunities sought engagement from employers within the local areas. So one of the educators said, not many of our students were given choices of where to go. The availability of suitable services is such that their choices are limited and their service provision is often not focused on their skills and on their likes. So a lack of opportunities and different types of opportunities to match with people's skill sets. Another service provider observed that there was also a stigma that a person with intellectual disability shouldn't be in open market employment. They said school leavers with intellectual disability often get 1 or 2 options. They are limited on what type of work experience they can get, as workplaces will often not take them on. Parent protection, rules and demands. So many of the young participants in this study still lived with their parents, including individuals who had been out of school for up to a decade. While some parents were content with living with their parents, others spoke of tense or difficult relationships with their parents around decision making. Christina, who was a younger participant, was upset with her mother for denying her the opportunity to go on a camp organised by the Disability Service for clients. She wanted to move away and live with one of the other participants in her group. She said, "I hate my mum. I should decide now." Paul frequently had arguments with his parents when they didn't agree on things. Some participants felt their parents had expectations that were difficult to achieve. Shyla explained that she found living with her parents stressful because they were pushing her to find work. "Sometimes I would like to move somewhere else. My parents keep telling me to find jobs and it's stressing me out." Other young people disagreed with their parents on work goals or on choices of friends. Paul said, "We're always fighting. I always stand up for myself all of the time." And the final sub-theme was longing for intimate relationships and a family of their own. Many participants felt desperately left behind their peers and their family members. They described desires for intimate relationships, finding a partner and having families of their own. And when siblings and peers achieved these milestones, they were desperately feeling left behind. Two of the older participants talked about longing to have a family because they felt like that was the way of finding a real sense of purpose and meaning in their life. For example, for Nick, the goal of having a family was a real thing. He told us that that was a thing that was wanted by lots of people and he was no different. Similarly, Aisha told us that her biggest wish was to raise her own family. She felt she was missing out. Aisha said, "My cousins and all that got married and they've got family now with kids and that. And I can see it. I'm saying to myself, I'm like behind them. One day I'll try to hopefully raise a family." All right, that is the end of the results of the findings of these young people's voices. And as I said, it's not a positive story, but it's such a powerful story, and it's so important that we take the time to listen to the story of these young people's. So I'm going to stop sharing now and ask Lise to come back to wrap up for us.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And I'm sorry that we are running a bit behind. So, we'll look at the discussion points fairly quickly. Our study reinforces and broadens what is known about the challenges facing young people with intellectual disability during their transition to adulthood, because first and foremost, it focuses on their views and experiences rather than those of their parents and other proxies. And while some experiences were shared, young people expressed aspirations and desires that were quite different from other participants. The young participants in our study had the same goals as other young people, but needed better support to become participating citizens, contributing meaningfully to their communities. Our findings reflect the stigma that remains for most people with intellectual disability wanting to enter the workforce, with questions on their ability to manage a job. Many had volunteer positions or work experience. Placements, paid employment was still remaining a distant dream for them. The sense of feeling stuck with life in disability service or in perpetual transition may be caused by conflicting beliefs and values between service providers and consumers. Young people expect to take on adult roles after leaving school. Midjo and Owen suggest that perhaps disability service providers often keep seeing young people as service receivers and therefore inadvertently through standardized processes might produce the institutionalized identities. So in our study, individuals felt that they were positioned as disabled without any other identities. And so it seems that lacking that autonomy and social role identity that others take for granted can have quite damaging consequences for young people. Our study also suggests that people with intellectual disabilities still lack proper input into planning and making decisions for leaving school. Despite the focus on pathways to employment and the NDIS promise of consumer choice and control, our findings suggest that very, very few people, young people with intellectual disability, are actually on a path to paid employment. One issue is the highly standardised nature of the NDIS, which leaves it inaccessible for people with intellectual disability. So that promise of choice and control is actually far from their reality. And this is one reason that Bigby has argued that the original design of the NDIS is poorly suited to people with intellectual disability without a formal structure of support for decision-making processes. People with intellectual disability, they're a real risk that they will ever have little input into planning and as a consequence experience these poorer outcomes compared to other groups. The other issue is that Australia really needs a nationally consistent approach that truly supports the transition from school into meaningful adult lives for young people with intellectual disability. The recent published guidelines in Australia Disability Strategy 2021 to 2031 and evidence-based best practice guidelines also suggest this. We insist, though, that for such policies, we already have policies, but for such policies to be effective, they must actually be underpinned by an accountability framework. There needs to be named responsible roles for this transition to be implemented with the student on planning their goals and setting timelines for implementation and actually initiating and implementing transition activities. Finally, we suggest that transition planning must be integrated into the high school curriculum and not seen as an add-on. Planning must be student-focused in process and development with interagency collaboration and family engagement. Identify goals, capacity and desired outcomes with transition and service plan that includes strategies for skill building through flexible learning opportunities. We also suggest that both school and service providers can play really important roles in supporting young people with intellectual disabilities through teaching communication skills, bringing individuals together to foster friendship and also create opportunities for normative social roles such as casual employment, intimate relationships, parenting and caring for others. All right, well, we've held you very long, but thank you for your participation, for coming in and participating online as well. We really enjoyed presenting for you, even though it ran a bit over time. I was a bit flustered in the beginning, sorry.
That's okay.
And but we got there in the end. So thank you, everyone. Please feel free to email me. Did my email go up? So please feel free to email me if you have any questions. If you would like a copy of the slides, I'm happy to forward those to you. Thank you, everyone.